So now onto the subject of error handling. In this lesson, we're going to talk about this subscribe and the ability to listen to errors and then perhaps take an action in the component. But also we're going to look at the errors in the services of the observable GET requests that we are making. So what we can in fact do is provide two kinds of errors. We can provide one in the component, which, for example, we could route to a different page. If we were to receive an error, we could display a message, you name it. But then also we could have this kind of back-end error handling where it's not so UI related, and we can have things such as retrying the request under the hood. And this is something that the observable paradigm, by using RxJS, and this is another great benefit of Angular's HTTP client module being used with observables, is that we get the ability to retry it. And this is a limitation of native JavaScript promises. So by using RxJS, it's going to make our lives a lot more easy and far more flexible with how we compose more complex applications with Angular. Now for this, what we're going to do, because we have our read one, we also have our create, we have our update. The easiest way that we can display an error is by updating an item that doesn't exist, because this is then going to throw an error because our item in the database is not going to be there. Now at the moment, we have our read one with an ID that we've already deleted. So what we can in fact do is pretend that we're reading this ID that we've already created and then try and update it. This is then going to throw us an error, which we can then handle accordingly. So we'll start off by demonstrating things inside this update block, and we're now going to see the power of RxJS pipes. So here we have a put, which then returns us an observable. Any observable like this, we can then use a dot pipe and then provide some operators. Now, an operator for catching errors is in fact called the catch error operator. So hit enter. This is then going to, up top, import our catch error from RxJS. So this is great. This is a good start. So how do we go about implementing this? Now, catch error is simply a function, which when there is an error, you can see that we have the error object, which is of type any. So we can then request it. So inside of this function, we can then start to handle our error message. So for now, we're going to say console.warn, and we want to warn of that error message. So it might be at this point that we want to, in fact, detect the kind of error message based on the HTTP status. We could then provide some custom text that we want to then pass to the UI, which could then be displayed to the user in a pop-up. But before we can do any of this, you can see if we hover, we can see type void is not assignable to type observable input any. Now this simply means that void is not returning anything from our function inside of here. So for us to essentially complete the circle, we need to then use RxJS throw error. This is then going to enable us using our subscribe block. So here we have subscribe, and we want to look at the subscribe block inside of our update function. This will then enable us to do something like this. So we can pass in an object instead of a function. So first we're going to say next, and then we're going to say error. Now for the error, we can then pass in a function, and we can say simply console.log on update error, and then we can log out the error message, which we then will get given through the function arguments, and then we can close off our object. So before we go any further, you may have the question in your head, what is this next? The function that we were supplying, this function up here, we're passing it in, that is the next function. This is just simply the success callback, if you want to think of it as that. So instead of called success, it's called next in RxJS. We can then, using the preferred object syntax, provide a next and an error, which then nicely leaves things on new lines for us. So any errors that we see, we can then handle accordingly in the UI. So it might be that we want to then route back to the home page, for example, after in our service, we'll then have implemented perhaps some retries. We might have a logging system on our server. We can pass the message back to the server, and we've kind of taken care of things behind the scenes. Now this throw error, we need to throw it, which is going to return a new observable. Now this is important because otherwise this line is never going to get called. Now throw error accepts a factory function, so we can pass in a function and we simply want to return a new error. Now this is going to be based off of this error message. So you can see that we have this error object. If I hit dot, we're going to get the error dot message. Now this error that's coming through is going to contain a lot of properties. You can dive through them. We have statuses, messages, you name it. So this will allow you to compose your own error messages should you wish, pass them off to the server, and then when you're ready to continue, we can rethrow the error, which is then picked up inside of our component. So let's save this out and give it a whirl. So we can open up our DevTools, head across to our network. If we hit refresh just to clean things up, we can say testing, choose an icon, and then add a description. Now if we press update, you can see that that took a moment because we've got a slight delay on it, but we have undefined. So if we jump into our console, we're then going to see some interesting stuff being printed out. So first off, we have a 404 not found because undefined, we're expecting to have that payload ID. So all it's doing, because we haven't hidden the update button yet, when we do not have an ID present, it's actually allowing us, so we've introduced a bug, but of course we introduce a bug to then catch the error and then fix these problems. So we have that initial error, and the second log is our console warning, where we're simply logging it out. This is your point in time where you can then detect the status, for example, 404, 503, 504, 500. You can then pass these error messages back to the server, and then when you're ready, you could perhaps return a different error message instead of saying something like HTTP failure response, and we can perhaps create something a bit user-friendly. Now you can see here that we have on update and then the error message being logged out. So even though the error response was printing out this object in the service, we've then taken just the message and passed it up to our .subscribe, where we can then handle it accordingly, display a message that's perhaps a bit more user-friendly to whoever is using our application. So this is a nice starter for 10 on how to manage your own error handling with RxJS. Now before we close off this video, what we're going to do is grab this content of our catch error, and we're going to change this slightly so we can reuse it across our other requests. Now what we're going to do is create a function called handle error. So this is going to be a private method on our class that we're going to then implement everywhere in a single line of code so we can keep things nice and contained. Now for this, we're going to use the private keyword because we don't want to access this outside of the scope of our class. So we can say handle error and then paste in our function. Now we don't need to make too many changes. We just need to remove the arrow syntax. We get given this error message. Now you can see here that when we hover, we have parameter error implicitly has an any type. Now if we jump up to our catch error, you can see that we have any. So what we can in fact do is, instead of using any, we're going to use HTTP error and then response. So we can hit enter, this then gets imported. And the reason that we're using this is because you can see the class that's generating this response here. So we can command click, we then get taken through to the type definition, we have name, message, error, and then the constructor of how this error message was created. So with this in mind, we now have some type safety. We can undo our .message. We can hit the dot. You can see we have error, headers, message, name, okay. Lots of things that we can then pluck properties from. So we now have a type safe, abstracted error message for our catch error. So what we're now going to do is add this to the rest of our methods. So after the tap on each one, apart from our read one, we can then add our catch error. So we've now handled this nicely. We now have the ability to detect the kind of error messages that we are then getting, but also we can take this one step further and detect it's a client-side or a server-side error. The way that we can do this is by looking at the error event. So instead of just console warning here, we're going to say if the error has an error property, which is an instance of this error event. Now, if we hover over this, it says events providing information related to errors in scripts or in files. So what this will mean is our error is coming from the client side. So what this essentially means is it's our Angular application that's throwing an error. Otherwise, we have a server-side error. So this allows us to then potentially start to break out our error messages based on status codes or the messages that come back from the client, because we don't get a code for the client errors. So here we could say console.warn client, and then we can pass in the error.message. Similarly, if we take this, we can add it underneath our server side, and we can say server, and instead of error.message, we're going to use the error.status. So inside of our if-else conditional, we could then communicate with the back end. We could pass it off to an error service, or if you had a particular status that's given to you, here might be a nice opportunity to go to the server and request a prettier error message, because we can't hold those inside of our application. So a backend developer would go and create these better error messages on the server. We could go and request it, bring it back, and then throw our new error with that new message. Otherwise, it's up to us to, as the client-side developer, provide a prettier error message that the user can then read that's a bit more helpful. So I hope you've enjoyed this video on error handling. This is really nice. We've ended up with a nice handle error function. We've talked about this error event for client side. We've looked at server side, and we've also looked at reusing the error by throwing it, which is then going to pass it up to our subscribe block. So with this in mind, we're going to move on to the next lesson where we're going to talk about retrying errors and some tips and tricks along the way.